A severed head may stay conscious for as long as 30 seconds after decapitation. A grotesque, fleeting half-minute during which the eyes can still blink, the mouth might try to form words, and the mind remains horrifyingly aware as life slips away. For Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, and perhaps the most infamous queen ever executed, this nightmare scenario wasn't just morbid theory. It was a grim possibility shadowing her final moments. While many modern versions of the tale strip away its darker edges, historical reality is far more chilling. Anne's death was no swift, merciful end. It was a staged performance of calculated cruelty, designed not only to eliminate her body, but to annihilate her memory, her status, her very identity. Her beheading was less an execution and more a final move in a brutal political drama. A methodical act of royal revenge, staged in full public view, meant to shatter what little dignity she had left. Though textbooks often summarize her fate with a single line, "executed for treason," the truth is vastly more disturbing. Anne's downfall was orchestrated with surgical precision, a psychological unmaking that dragged on for days, each moment engineered to break her spirit before her body. This wasn't just the end of a queen, it was a purge, a ruthless erasure of a woman whose intelligence, charisma, and influence had become intolerable to the king she once captivated. By May 19, 1536, Anne had been a prisoner in the Tower of London for 17 days. A cruel irony, as the same stone walls had once embraced her triumph during the lead-up to her coronation. Only 3 years earlier, she had ascended to the throne amid celebration and spectacle. Now she waited in a surreal purgatory. Her execution date constantly shifted, her mental anguish prolonged. It was Henry's final act of domination, turning time itself into a weapon against her. The king had even arranged for a skilled swordsman to travel from Calais to carry out the beheading, bypassing the traditional English axe. While this gesture is often interpreted as merciful, it also reveals just how choreographed her death truly was, a spectacle intended to be cleaner, quicker, and more visually palatable. Anne's final hours were marked by a surreal serenity. Eyewitnesses described her as oddly cheerful, even serene, in the face of impending death. To modern psychologists, her composure might be seen as dissociation, a trauma response in which the mind detaches from unbearable reality. She even joked that people would soon call her Queen Anne sans tête, Anne without a head, using grim humor to veil her dread. Beneath that facade, she was likely consumed by fear. Few records linger on the horror she must have felt as her character was publicly dismantled through accusations of adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the crown. What makes Anne's execution especially disturbing is not just the act of beheading, but the systematic erasure of her identity. Henry VIII didn't merely want Anne to die. He wanted her obliterated, her legacy rewritten, her achievements dismissed, and her daughter Elizabeth painted as illegitimate. The trial, the rumors, the charges, each step was crafted to paint her as a monstrous traitor, making her fate appear not only justified, but necessary in the eyes of the public. In the days leading up to her death, Anne was subjected to a barrage of grotesque and false accusations. Tales of orgies and incest, so extreme and implausible, they wouldn't survive a moment in any modern courtroom. Still, the damage was done. On the morning of May 19th, the sky above London was unusually clear, a jarring contrast to the grim ritual about to unfold. Anne had spent the night in prayer, seeking spiritual solace in the face of her unraveling fate. Tower records show she requested the sacrament at 2 a.m., kneeling for hours before the consecrated host. Her final hours were sleepless, filled with whispers and psalms, her thoughts surely spiraling beneath the surface of prayer. By sunrise, she had not slept in nearly a full day. Her body drained, her mind fraying at the seams. And when the lieutenant of the tower came to collect her, she was reportedly laughing, not from peace or acceptance, but from a mind pushed past its breaking point. Anne's execution date had been set, postponed, then reset more than once, an often overlooked but devastating psychological weapon. This intentional uncertainty about the exact moment of death inflicted profound mental anguish. It was a calculated move used to destabilize prisoners in their final days. When Anne was finally informed that her time had come, she was led out of her chamber and down the same stone passages where, only 3 years earlier, she had walked triumphantly as the queen-to-be. Now guards escorted her, not with reverence, but to ensure she did not flee. And those same courtiers who had once knelt before her watched her procession with cold detachment, their loyalty long since transferred to the next political current. The scaffold on Tower Green, built specifically for her execution, was curiously low, just 3 feet high, unlike the grand towering platforms often imagined in films. This was no accident. The short height meant Anne had to climb only a few steps, depriving her of the elevated dignity usually afforded to executed royals. That closeness to the ground brought her physically and symbolically closer to the crowd. And while modern portrayals often depict the event as grim and silent, in truth it bore a disturbing resemblance to a public festival. The crowd had been primed to gawk and judge. Anne's death was not simply justice, it was theatre, a state-sanctioned display meant to reinforce the king's power, particularly as a warning to women whose ambition threatened the natural order. Before kneeling, Anne was granted the traditional final speech, not out of compassion, but because custom required it. Her words, chosen with deliberate care, revealed both her sharp political instinct and the gravity of her position. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. On the surface, a submissive acceptance, but in reality it was a subtle act of defiance. By affirming the law while refusing to admit guilt, Anne exposed the hypocrisy of the system that condemned her. Her silence on the charges wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. A final message for those who still listened, that her downfall had more to do with politics than justice. In those last moments, stripped of crown, status, and support, she managed to assert the only power she had left. The truth implied between carefully chosen words. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of all was the king's absence. Contrary to popular depictions of royal justice, Henry VIII was nowhere near the Tower that morning. Instead, he remained at Whitehall Palace, waiting not in grief or solemnity, but in anticipation. As Anne's head was struck from her body, Henry was already celebrating his impending marriage to Jane Seymour, a grotesque reminder of just how completely Anne had been discarded. What was once a personal relationship had become pure politics. Her execution wasn't a tragedy to Henry. It was an administrative step in his pursuit of a male heir. Even the choice of executioner reflected a disturbing level of control. The king had sent for a French swordsman, a specialist known for clean, swift decapitations, and paid a large sum for his service. It may seem merciful on the surface, but it was yet another calculated cruelty in the grand performance of her downfall. Unlike the English axe, which often required multiple swings, the sword promised a quicker end. But to Anne, this man was a foreigner, a stranger in her final hour. No loyal servant, no familiar face, just an anonymous hand delivering the ultimate blow. And the blindfold, often mistaken as a kindness to shield her from the sight of the blade, served a different purpose entirely. It was a safeguard, a means of ensuring she wouldn't instinctively flinch, risking a gruesomely botched stroke. Anne chose to kneel upright rather than lay her head on a block, a French custom that made the task even more difficult for the swordsman. This posture demanded unimaginable self-control. She had to remain absolutely still, her body composed, her mind focused, even as death loomed inches away. Onlookers noted that her lips never stopped moving in prayer, while her eyes, hidden behind the cloth, twitched rapidly, trying in vain to detect the sound of steel in motion. The psychological torment of that moment, knowing you are about to die, but not knowing when, is a cruelty few historical narratives dare to describe. And while the beheading itself was shockingly swift, a clean single blow by Tudor standards, the aftermath was far less tidy. What happened in the seconds after the sword fell is something that polite history often edits out, preferring the clean legend to the raw and brutal truth of the execution ground. Eyewitnesses reported a chilling detail. Anne's eyes and lips continued to move for several seconds after the sword had struck. This grotesque response, a known phenomenon when oxygen lingers briefly in the brain, horrified those present. Some claimed her lips were still forming words, perhaps completing the prayer the sword had silenced. The sight was so macabre that several spectators fainted, while others turned away, unable to stomach the brutal evidence of the thin thread between life and death. Yet even in that moment of supreme vulnerability, Anne was denied dignity. No proper coffin had been arranged. Her ladies-in-waiting, trembling with grief and shock, were forced to improvise. They placed her severed head and body into a common arrow chest, an undignified box that symbolized how little preparation had been made for her burial. This oversight, while seemingly small, reveals volumes about how thoroughly Anne had been dehumanized. She was not a queen being laid to rest. She was a problem that had been solved. Her burial was rushed and impersonal, carried out without formal Christian rites, and her grave left unmarked in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower. No eulogy, no monument, just silence. As though Henry VIII hoped her memory might vanish as easily as her body had been removed. But the erasure didn't end with her death. In the following weeks, her image was scrubbed from court life. Portraits were destroyed or repainted. Her initials and royal emblems were torn down from palace walls. Even uttering her name in the wrong company could be politically dangerous. Henry's aim was not just to remove Anne, it was to erase her completely, to ensure that no one would remember her as queen or even as a woman worthy of sympathy. We often measure executions in terms of physical violence, but Anne Boleyn's death illustrates a deeper form of brutality, one that outlives the victim. The systematic destruction of her identity, her achievements, her place in history. For centuries, her story would remain fragmented, pieced together only by those determined to look beyond the king's official narrative. In the end, Anne wasn't just executed, she was nearly erased. Anne's execution did not only scar her legacy, it traumatized those forced to bear witness. Chief among them were her ladies-in-waiting, women who had once served her in courtly splendor, now reduced to caretakers of her mutilated remains. It was they who had to wash and prepare Anne's severed head and body for burial. These were not professionals trained in death rites. They were young noblewomen, terrified of being implicated in the Queen's supposed crimes. And yet they performed this ghastly task in silence, trying to maintain composure while privately unraveling. Some would later suffer from recurring nightmares. One reportedly entered a convent, abandoning court life altogether, unable to continue under the weight of what she had seen. The trauma didn't end with Anne. It radiated outward, chilling the court and reshaping the emotional climate of Henry's reign. Even the most loyal subjects now understood how swiftly favor could turn into fatal judgment. No one was safe. In the immediate aftermath, Anne's young daughter Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, was declared illegitimate. She was stripped of her title, removed from the line of succession, and left effectively orphaned. Her mother executed, her father openly disowning her. Court records show Elizabeth's status plummeted overnight. She no longer received clothing or education fit for a princess. Her household staff was dismissed. Her world was dismantled without warning or explanation. This targeting of a child, one too young to understand politics or treason, adds a new devastating layer to the cruelty surrounding Anne's execution. Her punishment extended to the innocent, another example of how Tudor justice knew no moral bounds. And the scene itself, often glossed over in sanitized dramatizations, was far from the quiet solemnity that films might suggest. The scaffold at Tower Green would have stunk of blood and rot, residue from past executions lingering in the May heat. Flies would buzz around the wooden platform, attracted by the scent of decay. The crowd, whipped into fervor, jeered and shouted as Anne approached. Some were paid plants, instructed to cheer her death, creating a terrifying wall of noise meant to overwhelm and confuse. To Anne, every step toward the scaffold was a descent into orchestrated chaos. The public spectacle, the yelling, the heat, the smell, the humiliation wasn't incidental. It was an essential part of Tudor punishment. Death was never the full sentence. Shame, fear, and degradation had to come first. Modern portrayals often cast Anne's final speech as a brave stand, but the reality was far more complex. Her praise of the king, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord, was not a genuine tribute. It was a survival tactic in a game she had already lost. Even in the face of certain death, Anne Boleyn was not free to speak her mind. Her final words were carefully chosen, not to reflect her true feelings, but to protect those she would leave behind. Elizabeth's future, the reactions of the gathered crowd, and the ever-present eyes of the king weighed heavily on every syllable. Her speech, often remembered as dignified and composed, was in truth the ultimate act of self-censorship. A woman muzzled by the knowledge that even her dying breath could be used as evidence or twisted into political propaganda. The sword that ended Anne's life was not merely a tool of death. It was a symbol of performance. Specially imported from France, it represented a deliberate choice by Henry VIII to turn the execution into an orchestrated event. He could have used an English axe. He could have used an Englishman. But that wasn't the point. Henry wanted a clean kill, a spectacle unmarred by clumsy swings or botched attempts. The executioner, paid handsomely for his skill, reportedly rehearsed on animals to ensure he would get it right in one stroke. This level of precision, this clinical approach to taking a human life, illustrates the true horror of state-sanctioned execution. It wasn't about justice, it was about message control. Anne wasn't just executed, she was filtered through a political machine engineered to transform human agony into a warning. The French swordsman wasn't chosen out of mercy, he was hired for his utility. His exotic method lent flair to the grim pageantry, and no English executioner would do it, not from conscience, but because the sword required a specialized technique that only trained foreigners possessed. The blade itself, light, curved, and razor-sharp, was engineered for a swift horizontal slice, not the brutal downward chop of an English axe. This difference matters. It tells us that even the method of Anne's death was curated. No detail was too small for Henry's stage. Her death had to be clean, efficient, and, most importantly, memorable. Theatrics were essential. Bloodshed had to be controlled. The Queen's end wasn't just a punishment, it was a demonstration. A performance with one clear message: power is fragile, and even a queen can fall. After the sword fell, a stunned silence settled over the crowd. Among the few who dared to write about what they witnessed was Thomas Wyatt, himself imprisoned in the Tower and a man who had once admired Anne. In his grief, he wrote of the little throat that had had so many jewels hung about it, a haunting reminder of how quickly royal splendor becomes decay. His words evoke the horror of watching a crowned queen reduced to a lifeless object, transformed from political force to political example. Before the blood had even cooled, the executioner held Anne's severed head aloft by the hair, a final flourish in the macabre theatre. This traditional gesture was meant to confirm the sentence had been carried out, but its effect was far more visceral. Blood still flowing from the neck, eyes frozen mid-expression, it seared itself into the memory of all who saw it. Her ladies, sobbing, rushed forward with linen to wrap what remained of their mistress, but the ritual of mourning had been replaced with the protocol of disposal. Tower records suggest her burial was conducted with brutal efficiency. The arrow chest, never meant to serve as a coffin, was lowered into a grave beneath the chapel floor. There was no full Christian ceremony, no mourners allowed, just a rushed interment, her remains laid among other victims of royal wrath. For a woman who had once worn a coronation gown and sat beside a king, her unmarked grave was the ultimate insult. No headstone indicated where Anne lay. For centuries, her exact burial site remained a mystery. This wasn't mere oversight. It was the final stage in a calculated erasure. Henry VIII didn't just want Anne dead, he wanted her unremembered. And for a time it worked. Within days of the execution, a new narrative was being written. Henry's propagandists got to work, reshaping the public's perception. Court poets, who once celebrated Anne's charm and intelligence, were now publishing verses branding her a harlot and traitor. The skilled French swordsman, hired for spectacle, was recast as a symbol of the king's mercy, his precision spun as kindness rather than cruelty. This sanitized version of events would dominate official histories for centuries, erasing the psychological torment that had defined Anne's final hours. Perhaps most chilling is how little Anne's death seemed to affect Henry. The very next day, he became officially engaged to Jane Seymour. The Queen's blood had barely dried when plans for a new marriage were underway. And within 2 weeks, he wed again, quietly but with calculated finality, at Whitehall Palace. A new chapter had begun, as if Anne had never existed at all. This cold efficiency exposes Anne's execution for what it truly was. Not the tragic end of a queen, but the calculated removal of a political obstacle. She had failed in the single duty expected of her, producing a male heir, and in the eyes of the Tudor court, that failure justified her elimination. Her death became a footnote in the broader narrative of statecraft and succession, her humanity lost beneath the machinery of monarchy. Yet the psychological torment of Anne Boleyn's final days extended far beyond the execution itself. In the weeks leading up to her death, Anne was subjected to an intense and deliberate campaign of mental destabilization. She was isolated in the Tower, subjected to repeated interrogations, deprived of sleep, and denied any meaningful contact with friends or family. Thomas Cromwell, the King's chief minister and architect of the case against her, orchestrated the charges using tactics that modern experts would classify as psychological torture. The strategic use of lies, the constant shifting of her legal situation, and the isolation served to wear down her mental defenses. By the time Anne was led to the scaffold, she was no longer the defiant, sharp-tongued queen known to the English court. She had been systematically dismantled, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Her famous composure on the morning of her execution wasn't stoicism. It was the final symptom of psychological collapse, and the state took no chances. Tower records reveal an extraordinary level of security surrounding her execution, unprecedented for even the most infamous traitors. The tower's garrison was doubled, with guards stationed at key entry points and throughout the grounds. These precautions were not intended to prevent Anne's escape. She had no illusions of rescue, but rather to prevent any disruption. The true fear was not of the condemned queen, but of what she still represented: a faction, a cause, a voice. Her very presence at the scaffold risked becoming a rallying cry, so the king ensured it was drowned out by military presence and silent compliance. Even the timing of the execution was calculated. It was scheduled for late morning, deviating from the dawn tradition. This shift allowed larger crowds to assemble in and around the tower, maximizing the event's visibility. Though only a select group of nobles were allowed to witness the actual execution within Tower Green, the announcement of her death was projected to the gathered masses beyond the gates. This was not justice, it was a warning, a performance of power designed to reinforce the king's absolute authority. Church bells rang out across London at the moment of Anne's death, signaling not just the end of a life, but the assertion of royal authority over an entire city. This chilling orchestration turned Anne's final breath into a broadcast of the king's power. Her private agony became a public ritual, death transformed into theatre and grief into governance. Yet one of the most overlooked tragedies of this story is the fate of those who died with her in spirit, if not in time. 5 men, including Anne's own brother George Boleyn, were executed just days before her. Charged with adultery and treason, their deaths were strategically timed to preempt any public doubt. By executing them first, Henry's court ensured their silence and solidified the official narrative. Had any of them spoken out, contradicted the charges, or declared Anne's innocence in their final moments, the state's carefully constructed web of lies might have unraveled. Instead, they were condemned on nearly identical, clearly fabricated evidence. This calculated elimination of 6 individuals under a unified legal pretext constitutes one of Tudor England's most brazen abuses of power. A purge that mirrors the orchestrated show trials of more modern autocracies, where legal proceedings are mere performance and guilt is a foregone conclusion. Today, a solemn memorial stands on Tower Green to mark what is believed to be the site of Anne's execution, but historical records suggest the scaffold was actually located elsewhere within the Tower grounds. That uncertainty about something so basic as where a queen was beheaded reveals how thoroughly Anne's story has been edited and manipulated. The physical and historical displacement of her execution mirrors the broader distortion of her legacy. The romanticized depictions in films and novels obscure the psychological torment, the character assassination, and the deliberate cruelty that defined her last days in May 1536. Anne Boleyn's execution was not simply the result of court intrigue or royal caprice. It was the culmination of a ruthless campaign to dismantle a woman who had risen too far beyond what Tudor society could tolerate. Her intelligence, ambition, and influence made her a target, and her fall was engineered with terrifying precision. She was not just executed, she was unraveled. Her legacy dismantled, her voice silenced, and her memory nearly extinguished. To understand the true horror of Anne's end, we must look beyond the single stroke of a sword. We must confront the machinery behind it, the months of psychological warfare, the carefully choreographed public shaming, and the systemic effort to erase her entirely from the narrative of history. Only then do we grasp the full weight of what happened. Not a clean death, but a total destruction. Not just an execution, but an erasure. From a modern psychological perspective, Anne Boleyn's execution stands as a chilling case study in state-sanctioned gaslighting and character assassination. The charges against her, adultery with multiple men, incest with her brother, conspiracy to poison the king, were so implausible they would collapse under scrutiny in any legitimate court today. Yet through a meticulous campaign of narrative control, public spectacle, and the strategic extraction of confessions, many under duress or torture, Henry VIII's regime succeeded in manufacturing Anne's guilt. This manipulation of reality, the deliberate reshaping of truth itself to serve political ends, may be the most terrifying element of all. Anne's fall wasn't merely a miscarriage of justice, it was a masterclass in authoritarian storytelling, a regime rewriting facts in real time to justify the destruction of a woman who had become inconvenient. Nearly 5 centuries later, the execution of Anne Boleyn continues to captivate, not because of the sword that killed her, but because her death marked the intersection of personal tragedy and political calculus. She became a symbol, not of treason, but of how fragile reality becomes in the hands of unchecked power. Her life was rewritten before it ended, her memory nearly erased, and her death recast as justice rather than vengeance. The enduring horror lies not in the moment the blade struck, but in how thoroughly a crown could command perception, suppress dissent, and distort truth. Anne's tragedy is not simply that she died, it is that her death became more enduring than her life, the final act of a regime that sought not only to silence a woman, but to obliterate her legacy. In reckoning with the full scope of Anne Boleyn's final days, the psychological torment, the humiliation, the disinformation, we confront more than Tudor brutality. We confront the anatomy of state violence, the ease with which narratives are weaponized, and the frightening malleability of truth in the face of absolute power. Her execution was not the end of a scandal, it was the triumph of narrative over reality, the obliteration of a woman through spectacle, and a timeless warning about how history can be bent to the will of the powerful. In the image of her severed head, held aloft before a roaring crowd, we are left with more than horror. We are left with a lesson about the cost of dissent, the machinery of erasure, and the terrifying vulnerability of truth.